Hello, everyone. I'm Ben Nobbs-Thiessen. I'm the chair of Mennonite Studies here at the University of Winnipeg, and I want to thank all of you for joining this virtual roundtable, Mennonite Central Committee and the Legacies of National Socialism, sponsored by our Centre for Transnational Mennonite Studies, MCC Canada, and MCC US. Before we begin our roundtable, I want to acknowledge that here in Winnipeg, we are situated on Treaty 1 territory, the traditional and ancestral lands of the Anishinaabe, Shnu, Assiniboine, Cree, Dakota, Dene, and Métis peoples. Given Mennonite settlement on Treaty 1 lands, any exploration of Mennonite history demands an ongoing and critical engagement with aspects of displacement and interaction between Mennonites and Indigenous peoples. Our panel today builds on recent scholarship that has given new attention to Mennonite entanglements with National Socialism before, during, and after the Second World War. This scholarship has highlighted the roles played by Mennonite Central Committee, a role by Ministry of Anabaptist Churches, and, as some of you may have already read, a special fall 2021 issue of MCC's journal Intersections explores different dimensions of this history. We've gathered together a few of the scholars that have contributed to MCC's Intersections to give brief presentations about their research findings today. Our panelists today might focus in particularly on the immediate post-war period as MCC prepared to resettle displaced Mennonite refugees, help them narrate their wartime experiences, navigate through the international aid system, and ultimately immigrate to Canada, Paraguay, and elsewhere. Well, the story of Mennonite post-war relocation has been extensively discussed in popular academic and family histories and autobiographies of the Great Trek or the Berlin Exodus. Almost immediately as it unfolded and over the subsequent decades, the entanglement with National Socialism has not been the central subject of focus. And I'm heartened to see in the past few decades a greater archival-based research into these entanglements. I say that not simply as a historian, but also as a descendant on my mother's side of post-World War II refugees. That extended family experienced many of the different possibilities of the post-war moment, including migration to Paraguay, directly to Canada, or repatriation to the Soviet Union. So I'm glad to see and be part of this panel today. I'm going to turn now to introductions for our roundtable. We have a formidable group of scholars here to join us. Dr. Aileen Friesen is a colleague of mine, an associate professor in the Department of History at the University of Winnipeg, executive director of the Plett Foundation, editor of the magazine Preservings, and co-director of the Center for Transnational Mennonite Studies. In addition to her recent book, Colonizing Russia's Promised Land, Orthodoxy and Community on the Siberian Steppe, she has published a chapter in the edited collection, European Mennonites and the Holocaust, which I would also strongly recommend for those attending today's talk. Another panelist, Dr. Stephen Schroeder, is teaching chair in the Peace and Conflict Studies program at the University of the Fraser Valley, that's in Abbotsford, British Columbia. He is also published in the edited collection, European Mennonites and the Holocaust, as well as the book, To Forget It All and Begin Anew, Reconciliation in Occupied Germany. Dr. Ben Goossen is here with us, and he is currently a visiting fellow at Harvard University and a fellow in the history of space technology with NASA and the American Historical Association. Goossen has also written on this subject. He is the author of Chosen Nation, Mennonites in Germany in a Global Era, published with Princeton in 2017. Our last panelist, Erica Weideman, is a postdoctoral scholar at Texas A&M University, where she received an MA and PhD in history with a specialization in immigration history. She has also contributed to the edited collection European Mennonites and the Holocaust, as well as this special issue of Intersections. Finally, we're really grateful to have Anna Holian join us from Italy, where she's on research leave. She's an associate professor in the School of Historical, Philosophical, and Religious Studies at Arizona State University. Her first book is really centrally related to the topic we're covering today. It's Between National Socialism and Soviet Communism, Displaced Persons in Post-War Germany. And it explores how Polish, Ukrainian, Russian, and Jewish refugees defined and represented themselves in that post-war moment. Specifically, it looks at how divergent historical narratives about the war, especially wartime encounters with Nazi and Soviet power, formed the basis for the development of different political communities in the post-war period. So we're glad to have her act as respondent for this session. Thanks to all of you for taking part in this. And then just a brief moment of instruction for the layout for today. Each of the panelists will have about 7 to 8 minutes to share an aspect of their research findings from intersections, and then Anna will have a moment, 8 to 10 minutes, to give a response to those reflections. After that, we'll open it up for questions. We've got till 3:45 Central Time for audience questions. So just make sure to put your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll proceed to that part after the conclusion of these short discussions. So our order today, we're going to start off with Ben. We'll turn to Erica, then Steve, then Aileen, and then Anna. So Ben, I'm going to turn the floor over to you, and the rest of us can mute our screens for your discussion. I'll give you an indication when there's about 1 minute left.
Great, thanks, Ben, and hello, everyone. I'm very pleased to be here. I'm honored to be on this panel with my esteemed colleagues. I'd also like to thank MCC and the Center for Transnational Mennonite Studies for putting on this event, and thanks to everyone in the audience for coming. With my brief time, I'd like to speak about the broader context of this panel, and specifically, I'd like to talk about the history of Mennonite anti-Semitism. This is a very tough topic, but it's an important issue. Today, Jews around the world face rising hostilities. That so many of you have gathered today to acknowledge this reality is heartening, and you are welcome in the collective work toward addressing anti-Semitism. Understanding the specific actions of MCC in the aftermath of World War II is an important aspect of dismantling anti-Semitism in the church and beyond. And our panel today draws on deep historical research, and I encourage everyone here to read the September 2021 issue of MCC's quarterly journal, Intersections. I'll begin with a very brief summary of what the Intersections special issue lays out in full. During the 1930s and 40s, a substantial minority of Mennonites, not only in Europe, but also in the Americas, became enamored with National Socialism. At the height of Hitler's empire building in World War II, a fourth of all Mennonites worldwide lived under Nazi rule. Then, after the war, MCC helped to move 15,000 Mennonite refugees out of Europe. Almost all of these individuals had received privileged Aryan status during the Nazi era. Most had received material goods, such as clothes and housing, taken from Holocaust victims. Adult men had served in Hitler's armies, and some murdered Jews. To be sure, levels of Nazi collaboration and wartime culpability varied significantly among the refugees that MCC helped. My own life has been enriched by friendships with people who were mere children during the war and whom MCC resettled. I am glad that these people received new homes across the Atlantic. Additionally, it is worth asking if there is a place for helping the needy, regardless of previous offenses they may have committed. One can imagine value in treating material want separately from legal guilt. Nonetheless, MCC's post-war work bears critical scrutiny. The organization advanced a narrative about Mennonites and Nazism that has far outlasted its refugee work. MCC claimed extensively and in public that refugees in its care should be seen primarily as victims. It claimed that most were not Germans and that they had not collaborated with Hitler's armies. MCC also sought to compare these refugees to Jews. This tactic, the choice to portray tens of thousands of Mennonites who had enjoyed privileged racial status in the Third Reich as akin to Jews, should be understood for what it was, a profound and willful misrepresentation both of the recent past and of the longer history of Mennonite-Jewish relations. Anti-Jewish prejudices among Mennonites dated to their origins in Europe's 16th century Reformation. Most of MCC's central leadership had come of age in contexts steeped in anti-Semitism, although of a very different variety than the eliminationist, genocidal version that reigned in Hitler's Germany during the Holocaust. There are many kinds of anti-Semitism, and it is worth pausing to consider how Jews and Judaism were understood among the kinds of people who later served with MCC after World War II. And I'll give you 3 quick examples. I've chosen quotations from prominent church leaders in the years prior to World War II, all with strong influence on MCC. These men came from several national contexts, reflecting the global strands of thought that shaped future MCC leaders, and crucially, all of them were anti-Nazi. My first example is from the diary of Christian Krabel, a US Mennonite and MCC worker in Ukraine in the early 1920s. Krabel's diary is riddled with anti-Semitic comments, including the lie that Soviet power lay, quote, in the hands of Jews, unquote. He compared Jews to the devil and accused Jewish women of sexual perversion. Krabel would go on to become the president of the US Mennonite General Conference. My second example comes from a 1934 letter by the German pastor Christian Neff, who is widely considered to be the father of Mennonite World Conference. In this letter, Neff railed against what he called Jews and Jew lovers, and he deployed other words that I will not utter aloud. Third and finally, I'll read a short quote from Benjamin B. Jantz, who had helped to move tens of thousands of Mennonites out of the Soviet Union during the 1920s. Jantz himself relocated to Canada, and in 1935, he wrote the following in a Canadian newspaper, quote, "Call it patriotism or fanaticism. It is in all Jews and makes this nation, once so graced by God, capable of committing the greatest crimes in the world," end quote. To repeat, these three individuals were all anti-Nazi. To the extent that there was an anti-fascist caucus among the most senior leaders of the global Mennonite church during the years before World War II, this was it. So what did it mean for MCC after the war to claim that Mennonites were like the Jews? Ultimately, this was a deeply disingenuous formulation that directly helped former Nazis and Nazi collaborators to whitewash their wartime activities. The claim that Mennonites were like the Jews also contributed to a false sense, continuing to the present day, that Mennonites do not need to atone for anti-Semitism. The religious studies scholar John Campen has evaluated Mennonite-Jewish relations in comparative perspective in a recent article. Campen's article focuses on Mennonite Church USA, but his remarks are relevant beyond the US context. Past histories of anti-Semitism are not unusual in the larger Western Christian tradition. What is unusual, Campen writes, is that still today, Mennonite institutions have not in any formal manner grappled with the issue of their relationship to Jews and Judaism. Other faith groups have issued statements, adopted study guides, engaged Jews in dialogue, and reflected on how their theology might need to be amended in light of the Holocaust. Mennonites, in general, have not. The public narrative that MCC told after World War II to facilitate its transatlantic refugee operations, a tale about the providential salvation of a peaceful and persecuted people, allegedly at least as deserving of aid as Holocaust survivors, helped to chill serious inquiry into Mennonite anti-Semitism into this century. I'll conclude my remarks by drawing your attention to some resources that might be helpful for thinking through next steps. Last year, the journal Mennonite Life published an article by the scholars Lisa Shirk and Mark Gopin entitled "A Mennonite Agenda for Research and Action on Anti-Semitism." This article contains helpful suggestions for many kinds of institutions and people, including Mennonite conferences and seminaries, sociologists and political scientists, pastors, trauma experts, and peace builders. MCC's past actions contributed to a long silence about Mennonite anti-Semitism, and now it is possible for all of us to speak up. So I'll leave it there, and I look forward to hearing from my fellow panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben, and we'll just turn it directly over to Erica.
Thank you so much, and good afternoon, everyone. In my article for Intersections, I briefly shared some of the ways that MCC and Mennonite immigrants convinced officials of their eligibility for immigration despite wartime actions that may have precluded them from entering the Americas on UN assistance. So in the next few minutes, I'd like to share in slightly more detail how information about wartime collaboration impacted immigration eligibility and interactions between MCC and UN organizations. There were several successive UN organizations that operated in Europe after World War II. The first was the Intergovernmental Committee on Refugees, or IGCR. MCC requested funds from IGCR to transport Mennonites from Europe to Paraguay. But before IGCR sponsored those immigrants, it wanted to ensure that they were eligible for aid as displaced persons. As I briefly explained in my Intersections article, there's an important difference between DPs and refugees. DPs were eligible to receive UN aid and visas. Ethnic German refugees were not. Internal documents reveal that UN officers argued over the ethnic background of Soviet Mennonites who had most recently lived in Ukraine but centuries before came from Holland. MCC presented the case that they were not German, but Dutch. And for the most part, UN officials accepted this Dutch explanation. Questions, however, about Mennonites' wartime experiences arose. And in particular, IGCR wanted to know how the group had arrived in Germany from Ukraine. It mattered whether they left on their own or whether they had Nazi assistance. MCC responded that Mennonites in Ukraine were distinct and separate from other ethnic Germans there. And so IGCR created a document that focused specifically on the eligibility of Mennonites based on their unique circumstances that separated them from other ethnic Germans. IGCR decided that Mennonites would be eligible as DPs if they were of Dutch origin and had been forced to leave their homes in Ukraine. But if a Mennonite was ethnically German and willingly left with the German army's help or had aided the Third Reich, they would be ineligible. The special IGCR committee concluded that while it was unclear, there was no evidence that the Mennonite group left Ukraine on their own free will while, quote, counting on German assistance. IGCR's definition of active collaboration did not include employment in German industry or agriculture, but they decided that Soviet Mennonites still, quote, required special individual investigation. For instance, if IGCR found out they had accepted German citizenship, they would be automatically excluded from UN assistance. Overall, though, IGCR gave the Mennonite group, quote, the benefit of the doubt. Although IGCR decided to take Mennonites at their word, they did take their fact-finding mission very seriously. They realized that their report might have a basis for future decisions, but were satisfied that they had made, quote, a thorough study of the matter. And their decision granted Mennonites with Dutch-sounding last names DP status. In August of 1947, just a few months after IGCR believed that they had conclusively settled the Mennonite eligibility question, the Preparatory Commission of the International Refugee Organization, or PCERO, reopened the case. At an eligibility conference in Paris, it was decided that for the moment, all Volksdeutsche would be ineligible for ERO assistance. After closely examining Mennonite applications for PCERO assistance, it was discovered that out of 674 Mennonites requesting assistance, 445 of them had previously registered as Germans, with an additional 63 registered as Volksdeutsche. With Germans and Volksdeutsche barred from UN assistance, MCC had to figure out how to get past this block. A UN official wrote, quote, IGCR never received an official ruling regarding these people, and little is known regarding their background except that provided by the Mennonite Central Committee, end quote. PCERO ultimately decided that those who stated they were German before the end of the war most likely received German citizenship and were therefore ineligible for DP aid. Those who claimed to be German after the war may have done so to avoid repatriation, and PCERO would individually review those specific cases. A UN official stated, we still think that it's sound policy to rule Mennonites who took German citizenship ineligible, whatever their ethnic origin. However, the actual circumstances under which that happened are of the greatest importance, and we realize that many Mennonites took German citizenship in order to avoid forcible repatriation to Russia, end quote. Most dramatic, however, was PCERO's prediction that over 66% of Mennonite cases would be ineligible, whereas before, PCERO had deemed close to 100% of Mennonite cases eligible for immigration aid. While PCERO had been surprised to find that Soviet Mennonites held German citizenship, they were shocked to discover that some had served in the German military. The eligibility conference's resolutions, combined with these new findings, led to a hurriedly composed Notes on Mennonites, distributed to various immigration centers. An attachment explained that the documents were, quote, issued in their present rough form because of the urgency of giving to field eligibility personnel the latest information available on this category of persons. In 1948, between late June and mid-July, PCERO halted Mennonite immigration. The standoff continued into the fall. And on October 3rd, 1948, IRO decided that Mennonites from the Soviet Union would be eligible as DPs if they could argue that they received German citizenship under duress. As information came to light about wartime service, German citizenship, and the circumstances under which they left Ukraine, Mennonite eligibility was nearly constantly under investigation. And despite IRO's best efforts to make DP eligibility an unambiguous issue, it remained a fluid matter, dictated by appeal boards, pressure from governments and organizations, and the identity of the immigrants themselves. It was under these circumstances that MCC maintained relief operations while lobbying, producing historical argument, and doing all that they could to help Mennonite ethnic Germans immigrate to the Americas. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Erica. Steve, we'll let you take the floor next.
Great, thanks. Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you all. And I'm really pleased that we're having this event and that so many people are attending it. And I think it's very important issues that we're working through here. And I want to thank the organizers, Ben and others at the UW, and also those who edited the Intersections volume. And I encourage you to read that volume as well. I want to start by acknowledging that I'm situated on the traditional land of the Stalo people here in what has become known as the Fraser Valley of British Columbia. I'm grateful to live and work and play in this region, which Indigenous people have cared for wonderfully for over 10,000 years. And I'm dedicated to the ongoing reconciliation work with my Indigenous neighbors. What I've just stated here is not only an appropriate beginning to my comments, but it's directly related to our topic of Mennonite and more specifically MCC's entanglement with National Socialism. While in search of the privileges of non-resistance, not swearing an oath to any government, freedom of religious practice and education, exemption from military taxes, and specifically related to our topic today, while in search of a better life in the aftermath of war, Mennonites have been part of colonial practices for many centuries. The Mennonite historical record has, until relatively recently, focused on the suffering and trauma of the Mennonite people, which has certainly been part of the Mennonite experience. And it has sidelined or outright ignored Mennonite participation in nationalism, war, colonialism, and genocide. While the rest of the world, particularly the German nation, has been struggling and working through the legacies of Nazism and the Holocaust, Mennonites have been able to avoid this work in relation to their own community and have instead focused on the difficulties and suffering they endured after the war. I commend Mennonite historians, my fellow panelists and others, and MCC for taking this courageous step in addressing head-on this important topic. As the editors of the Intersections volume stated, quote, MCC firmly opposes anti-Semitism alongside all forms of racism. MCC commits itself to continued examination of its history and to discerning how to respond to this history in ways that are faithful to its grounding in the gospel of reconciliation, end quote. Without accurately and honestly addressing the past, it is impossible to move forward with integrity and effectiveness in this important work of reconciliation. With this in mind, I'll now offer some comments on what I discovered when researching MCC work with the Danziger Mennonites in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War. In the brief time I have, I want to focus on three areas in relation to MCC's work with Danziger Mennonites, all of which are central to MCC's identity and self-understanding, which I think has been and is central in its work. First, the focus on Mennonite victimhood. Secondly, the notion of Mennonites being in but not of the world. And third, faithfulness to its grounding in the gospel of reconciliation. MCC was formed to help Mennonites in times of suffering, notably in the violent upheaval of Mennonite life in Ukraine. This work fits well with the notions of victimhood in Anabaptist Mennonite history, which stems back to the Reformation. This mentality is evident in MCC work with Danziger Mennonites, as MCC workers repeatedly claimed that these Mennonites were victims of the war by focusing on Anabaptist peace theology and on post-war suffering. This narrative was grounded in the MCC claim that Danziger Mennonites were not really German, But we're beyond national affiliation. This was done to avoid affiliation with Nazism, claim victimhood, and gain privileges from the authorities in terms of aid, movement, and emigration. In this endeavor, MCC claimed that German Mennonites were not German, but Dutch or of no national affiliation to gain privileges, while at the same time, MCC workers claimed that German Mennonites in Poland were German in order to avoid Soviet control of them. Thus, the powerful historical notions of Mennonite victimhood and unique and pious otherness factored into MCC work with Danziger refugees. The historical record does not align with this MCC rendition of Danziger Mennonite life under National Socialism. Historians have documented how Danziger Mennonites forged deep roots in Prussia in the region around Danzig and assimilated into German society fully. Under Nazism, these Mennonites were deemed by the German authorities to be of good Aryan stock, and they participated in the German-led onslaught on Europe, including attacks on Jews and other civilians. Danziger Mennonites served in the German army willingly, often volunteering prior to conscription, served as camp guards in concentration camps, and utilized concentration camp inmates as farm laborers. After the war, just like the top Nazi brass, like Adolf Eichmann, for example, who changed his name and fled to hide and hid in Argentina, Mennonites also used aliases at times and fled to Canada and South America to escape justice with MCC assistance. However, this is where the similarities between the Mennonites and other Germans ends, which brings us to my third point of MCC's commitment to being faithful to its grounding in the gospel of reconciliation. The German nation, including its government, public institutions, churches, and many NGOs, has been working through the Nazi past for over 70 years. Germany has a strong record of acknowledgement, compensation, and reconciliation work regarding the victims of Nazism. German historians grappled with how to interpret the Nazi past in public debates and publications during the 1980s. And this work is ongoing, public, and evident to anyone in Germany, to visitors, and to the world. Somehow, however, Mennonites have not engaged in this important work. Only recently have Mennonite historians and lay people started to come to terms with Mennonite collusion with Nazism. MCC has been and continues to be a central pillar, a galvanizing organization in the Mennonite experience, as it played a significant role in shaping Mennonite understanding and interpretation of Mennonite support of Nazism, particularly in claiming that Mennonites were above national affiliation and were victims of the war. It too became entangled with National Socialism and furthered these false narratives. Just as MCC was a leader in shaping this understanding, it is now a leader in truth-telling and aligning its activities with the historical record in an open and honest way. This is admirable and very important in not only moving forward with courage, honesty, and transparency, but in moving forward with its mandate of being a light in the world and being faithful to its grounding in the gospel of reconciliation. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much, Stephen. And our final panelist, Aileen, the floor is yours.
Thank you. And thanks everyone for joining us. First of all, I'd like to say that it's fitting that we're having this panel as it is Holocaust Education Week, and the Jewish Heritage Center in partnership with the Jewish Federation of Winnipeg are holding a number of events that I encourage you to attend. And one thing that I've been doing, and I also encourage others to do the same, those of us who have Mennonite heritage that is to go to the Yad Vashem website, which has a central database of Shoah victims' names, so victims of the Holocaust, and look up places like Molochansk, or as we would know it, Hauptstadt. You'll find names of victims like Maria Scheffer, who was born, lived, and then was murdered in Hauptstadt, or Lubov Fogel, who was born, lived, and was murdered in Hortitsa. There are many other names, including the names of children like Sonia Tolchenskaya. This list on the Shoah website, on the Yad Vashem website, is not comprehensive, but it helps to bring some humanity back into this discussion. And as my mentor, John Paul Hemke, always reminded his students, that these are real people who had lives and they deserve to have a name. And I think it's important that in Mennonite scholarship that is focusing on these issues, that we start to include Jewish names in our endeavors. And so I encourage others to educate themselves about the victims of the Holocaust in Mennonite, what we traditionally view as Mennonite villages. So I wrote about Mennonite engagement or MCC's understanding and attempt to define the deserving. And I think that this is an important topic because in a lot of cases, people who come out of this experience, refugees who come out of this experience are feeling as if they're feeling as if the way in which they experienced this period is not being well represented. And I just want to highlight the ways in which other organizations were defining these people. So other organizations, be it the International Refugee Organization or other predecessors to that organization, or MCC itself, and how these other organizations were debating and trying to define who these people were and not allowing them, sometimes not allowing them to define themselves, and in other cases, giving them an easy out, an easy explanation for who they, for not dealing and addressing with some of the issues that they had faced. So we can see from the experience of, I focus mainly on Soviet refugees who are coming out, we can see from this experience that they have a long history with repression from the 1930s, and we shouldn't discount this history of repression in the Soviet Union and how this shaped and impacted the ways in which they engaged with National Socialism during the occupation of Ukraine. We also shouldn't forget that there were people who didn't necessarily want to leave the Ukraine when in 1943, when people were pulled out of there, although there were many who welcomed the opportunity and were going to build a new life elsewhere. So this idea of voluntary leaving of the Soviet Union is, of course, problematic when we're dealing with them, with this group. Of course, the international refugee system had a whole host of refugees that they were dealing with, and we're not just focused on the Mennonite case and situation. And MCC itself also had shortcomings in the way that it was dealing with these refugees. As been covered, they presented them as Dutch. Now, of course, this is a historical argument in which Mennonites have often used this Dutch identity in ways when they are needing to make an argument that they are someone else. So it's not as if MCC made up this argument, but the reinvention of this argument in the post-war era is very interesting and problematic, and that they kept doubling down on these arguments in the post-war period. Of course, initially, it makes a lot of sense as they are trying to move as many people out as possible and trying to maintain access to resources. But the continuation of these claims and the fact that we haven't interrogated them until relatively recently shows the problematic nature of them. As MCC was engaging with these refugees coming through, in my findings, I discovered that it is not only the National Socialist issue that is coming into play, it's also the issue of communism. And so MCC is finding that it's dealing with people who have backgrounds that are tainted in a variety of ways. So some of these backgrounds are tainted through experiences with National Socialism. So in the case of Soviet refugees, we see mayors, we see people who are involved in the killing squads, we see all sorts of ways in which Mennonites collaborated, but we also see ways in which Mennonites who had engaged in the communist regime are also coming out during this period and are in MCC refugee camps, and how this is causing tension within camps. This is an issue that is being raised in which people are identifying other Mennonites who they feel had something to atone for under the Soviet regime, and this is causing problems. Ultimately, MCC decides, and I think this deserves further inquiry, decides to sort of just let it all go. They aren't necessarily interested in the truth. The truth is problematic on many fronts, and so they just kind of allow things to continue on, and are also very aware of the ways in which the truth could disrupt their future work. And so they have a vested interest in making sure that this sort of party line is being met throughout this process. And this willingness to maintain this party line gives the ability of other people who have committed crimes in the Soviet Union to kind of follow suit and not address any of these issues. And there's also other themes at play. So we can see ideas of anti-Semitism. We can also see issues of patriarchy unfolding in this, and the ways in which Mennonite refugees sort of play the game, the ways in which they use their networks to make themselves seem more respectable. And that is one case that I focus on is the case of Heinrich Wiebe, who was the mayor of Zaporizhia. He was involved in implementing policies against Jews, collecting money. He says that he wasn't involved in the massacre that occurred in 1942, but that is not quite believable. And he is one who absolutely sort of ignites this idea of Mennonitism and presents himself as being kind of a pillar of the community that comes out with some atonement attached to it, but without getting into many details about what actually took place. And this is accepted by sort of the Mennonite hierarchy that is operating both at the MCC level and also at the level of the Canadian Mennonite Board of Colonization, which is another organization that deserves some inquiry. And so maybe I will wrap up my comments here, but just to re-emphasize what Ben mentioned is that this idea of anti-Semitism needs to be addressed fully and researched fully and fully for all groups of Mennonites that fall under the MCC umbrella. And I think it's important for us to dive deeper, not just quotes coming out, but to use that to facilitate further discussion. So how were Swiss Mennonites engaged, or how did they engage with Jews? What were they writing about Jews? How were Russian Mennonites engaged with this issue? And how were Mennonites who come out of the 1940 stream engaged in this issue? And I think that there's a lot of research that needs to be done to help uncover the different ways in which anti-Semitism has been operating among Mennonite organizations, but also among the broader Mennonite community. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Aileen. We've concluded the 4 short presentations from our panelists, and we're now going to turn to our respondent, Aileen, who's going to have about 8 to 10 minutes to reflect on these presentations. As Anna's doing that, just keep in mind you can post your questions for any of the presenters in the Q&A, under the Q&A button. Thanks so much.
Okay, so I wanted to first say a big thank you to Ben for inviting me to comment on this panel. I really learned a lot from these presentations and from the articles that I read in Intersections. And I'm really thrilled to see that people are doing such interesting work. So I want to focus my comments largely on the relationship between MCC and the emerging refugee regime after the Second World War, because this was sort of the focus of the presentations. And I think this is where really some of the most important insights of the presentations are. So I wanted to first just briefly sketch in the larger context, some of which was already sketched in by Erica in particular. So the key concept in early post-war refugee work was nationality, defined in both political and in cultural terms. So what nationality you possessed or were said to possess was essential to determining where you were supposed to be, where you belonged in the emerging post-war order of nation states. And the initial goal of sorting people by nationality was to return everyone to their home countries, and I put home in quotation marks, though these were not necessarily the places where the people in question had lived before or where they wanted to be. And the nationality concept also determined what kind of assistance you were going to receive as a refugee. Refugees from allied countries were generally classified as displaced persons and received assistance from the international community. And in practice, this meant the nascent United Nations, whereas refugees from Axis countries were not generally entitled to international assistance, and it was up to their home countries, again in quotation marks, to help them. And in practice, this meant that they usually received meager assistance since their home countries were already struggling with the massive consequences of the war. So one of the main issues that the functionaries of the early post-war refugee regime dealt with was deciding the nationality of any given individual. And this was an inherently difficult and ultimately, I think, futile process, given the multinational nature of the regions that most refugees were coming from. But many people also sought to have themselves nationally reclassified. And I think that's what we're mainly talking about here. And there were numerous reasons for doing so. First, in order to avoid deportation. Second, to gain access to a better standard of living as a displaced person. And third, eventually also to gain opportunities for emigration once such opportunities really opened up. And the history of MCC and Mennonite refugees fits into this larger context, and I think offers a very interesting example of an organized institutional effort to effectively reclassify an entire group of people. And the fact that MCC seems to have largely succeeded in this endeavor is also very interesting, given the really kind of intense focus that organizations like UNRWA and the IRO put on sort of weeding out people that they did not think were real displaced persons. And I think this case invites comparison with other efforts at reclassification. And here I'm thinking specifically of the efforts of both Jews and Ukrainians to have themselves reclassified as distinct nationalities rather than as members of their respective states or former states. And we're also obviously talking about populations that are intertwined in many, many different ways. And what we see here is another effort at sort of disentangling populations and people kind of taking the lead in disentangling themselves. And the history of MCC and Mennonite refugees also further demonstrates to what extent refugee policy and refugee practice diverged during this period. So moving forward, I think it would be really great to have all of the authors further situate the history of MCC in this larger context in order for us to better understand how MCC's actions fit into a broader pattern and how they contributed to delineating some of the main features of the early post-war refugee regime. And here I'm thinking specifically of the transition from a nationality-based system in the early post-war period to one which was organized around the idea that a refugee was an individual fleeing persecution. And the comparison between Jewish and Mennonite refugees is especially interesting in this context, given that both groups define themselves as persecuted transnational communities, even though their wartime experiences were obviously vastly different. So I had a few kind of general questions or kind of question groups that I also wanted to kind of throw out there for the panelists. First, I was really interested to know more about Mennonite refugees in the context of the German refugee population, because this was not really mentioned or really only mentioned at the margins. So why was MCC so focused on finding Mennonite refugees new homes elsewhere? Why not focus on helping Mennonites make new homes in Germany itself? For somebody who's not a specialist on Mennonite history, it seemed to me that there was a larger history of MCC and of migration in Mennonite history that undergirded this focus on emigration and that could be better sketched out. I was also curious to know whether MCC worked with the German authorities to help refugees, and if so, what those interactions looked like. And how did MCC work change over time? I found it very interesting that MCC continued to focus on emigration into the mid-1950s, when in the meantime, a robust program of assistance for people identified as ethnic German refugees was put into place, and the general economic situation in Germany began to look downright rosy, and Germany suddenly seemed to be a good place to be. Did MCC try to take advantage of the changing circumstances, and if so, how? And then my second set of questions has to do with the ideological and political profile of MCC itself during this era. In the articles in the journal, there was a lot of very interesting material on individual people associated with MCC, various leading figures, but I had a harder time grasping where the institution itself stood on the key ideological and political issues of the era. And it may be that this is in itself a very difficult question to answer, given the transnational nature of MCC and its work. And I especially wanted to know more about where MCC stood on the issues of communism and fascism. While it seemed to be opposed to both of these ideologies, in practice, it turned out to be significantly more anti-communist than anti-fascist, and I'd like to know why this was the case. Ben mentioned anti-Semitism as kind of a feature of both, I guess, the more fascist and the more anti-fascist oriented members of MCC. And I wonder whether this is kind of the crux of the ideological affinity with fascism and National Socialism, or whether there were other elements of that ideology that MCC found appealing. And I was wondering how many people who were working for MCC in Europe were themselves refugees, and how this might have influenced MCC's work. So I'm thinking in particular of people who worked within the camps where Mennonite refugees lived, and people who would have therefore had an opportunity to coach refugees on how best to present their cases. And more generally, and finally, I'd like to know more, and Aileen sort of gestured toward this, I'd like to know more about the extent to which refugees, how refugees saw themselves, and the extent to which they themselves helped determine MCC action. We know from other studies of post-war refugees that they were often very actively involved in rewriting their histories in order to make them better fit the emerging post-war order, and that they were very active in lobbying the international organizations to basically plead their case. So to what extent was MCC not just leading the actions of Mennonite refugees and not just dictating to them how best to present their cases, but to what extent was it also listening to what refugees had to say and kind of following their lead? So thank you very much, and I look forward to learning more.
Well, thank you so much, Anna, for those comments, and to all the panelists. I'd like, before we turn it over to questions from the audience, if any of the panelists wish to respond to Anna's comments there at the end, I can allow you to respond in the order you wish. Just simply take the floor. And I will stop my alarm. You're right on time, Anna. And in the meantime, as you respond to that, I'll go through the Q&A here to see what else we have.
Well, I can jump in and just say, first of all, thank you, Anna, for your comments and for your scholarship that is so helpful in providing the larger context for understanding the place of Mennonites and MCC in the post-war context of the larger refugee situation in Europe and the broader political context that occurred in. I really appreciated this perspective that you've brought today and that you've shared in your work generally. I think it would take us a long time to fully flesh out the all the answers to the research agenda that you've put on the table for us, but one of the things that you said really struck me as being really quite sort of new as a concept for me to think about, and I wanted to respond to because I think it speaks to a couple of the questions that you asked, and it's why is it that MCC was still interested in bringing refugees across the Atlantic in the early 1950s at a time when many of them could have continued to live in post-war West Germany at a time when the economy was improving there and when there would have been more resources for them in that place. And just to give one possible piece of an answer, it strikes me that one of the sort of longer contexts here is the idea that would have been relatively prominent in MCC circles, especially among the sort of North American central leadership of the organization, that there was a kind of ethnic Mennonite community or Mennonite people that was actually somewhat separate from the German people, and that the true carriers of that tradition were not in Germany from a kind of theological standpoint, but rather in North America. Germany, for MCC leaders at that time, would have represented what they would have called Prussian militarism, and MCC leadership was very strongly pacifist oriented, and much of their programming in the 1940s in North America had focused on helping young Mennonite men who would have been conscripted into serving in the military during the Second World War avoid that by serving in alternative service capacities. And so to the extent that they could reunite more of what they would have considered the Mennonite people or their spiritual brethren in North America or in South America, although in the 1950s, there was much more immigration going to especially Canada, that would have been considered a kind of ideological win from the standpoint of central MCC leadership.
To add on to what Ben said, I'm also curious if there was a lot of fear that still existed. I know, thinking about my grandmother's family who did immigrate to the United States, I mean, even decades later, there's this, on some level, this fear that somehow they would be found out or they would be taken back to the Soviet Union. And so I'm wondering if that was perhaps part of it, just to put the Atlantic Ocean between them and put a little more distance as a reason for why immigration continued to be so important. And then to refer to your question about what was happening on the ground in Germany, I know that communities did develop, or rather refugees were added to some Mennonite communities there in Germany, thinking of Espelkamp in particular, both refugees from the Second World War as well as Aussiedler several decades later that came and became part of these communities that stayed in Western Germany.
Sorry.
Go on, Steve.
No, go ahead. I mean, it's fine.
I just wanted to make a comment about the nationality question and the reclassification of people. And this is always a perennial question among Mennonites. And we can see this in the Soviet Union, where they're being classified a certain way. They wanted to be classified as their own distinct nationality. That didn't fly with the Soviets. And so they get reclassified. So this idea of Mennonites struggling against these classifications that are being placed on them is not just happening in this post-war period. It's a longer dialogue that was taking place as Mennonites tried to negotiate their position within nation states. And I also wanted to just respond briefly to the idea of how much input do refugees have into this conversation about who they are. And I would say that in this situation, there's not a lot. It's being farmed out to North America, and North America is deciding who these refugees are in conjunction with the people on the ground working for MCC. And you can see this in the correspondence that some of these refugees have with other people, is that they're definitely feeling like they're not being listened to and that they're not being a part of these conversations about who they are. And so I think that there's a limitation on how much they were involved in that dialogue.
Yeah, I was just going to say, thank you, Anna, for your comments. And you make a really good point about the kind of reciprocity of understanding of Mennonites, understanding MCC's work. And the way I see it is, it's all kind of part of a Mennonite historical view of Mennonites themselves and how they are in the world, and it's really been a long history and a long related self-understanding of victimhood, of persecution, right from the Reformation, from the founding of the Anabaptist Mennonite movement. And so the material that I found, the first-hand accounts, interviews, just comments, poems, letters that are written, are really religious in nature, right? So they're quoting scripture, they're talking about how God will save them from their suffering, and there's, not surprisingly, little to no reflection on the misdeeds and the alignment with National Socialism or communism, whatever the case, right? So it's a time of transcendence, right? Living in the rubble and the mess of it all, including the ideology attached. It's a time to transcend and look at how to move forward. And yeah, again, not surprisingly, it's a time to couch it in familiar terms. And when, especially in times of suffering and trauma, people generally go to, that kind of base understanding and making sense, and it's not a negative self-understanding, right? And so there's undoubtedly a reciprocity there, I think, between how people are talking about themselves, seeing themselves, but also MCC, I argue, is showing up with the same type of narrative, right? If it's founded in response to suffering, that would be a major transition to think of to help Mennonites who may be perpetrators. That's a brand new kind of concept, right? And how to even enter that into the equation and to address it. And I guess look at what we're doing now. This is 70 some years later, and it's taken this long to actually do that, right? So that's a really good point, though. I haven't really thought so much about the reciprocity there, but I think it makes a lot of sense. And also in terms of settling in Germany, the period that I focused on was really up till 1949. In other work, in the book project, I took it into the 50s, but I wasn't focusing on the Mennonite people in that project so much. And from my own family experience, that what I understand is that it was a really horrible time living in bombed out Europe, and Western Germany was not their home. Danzig was leveled, and the Red Army rolled through there, and we all lost our homes and the land. So when in my family's case, when Canada opened up and there's opportunities there, farming opportunities, also opportunities for urban life, which my family went from farm life to urban life. People took that, right? And there's strong connections and to a new beginning. So it's either a new beginning and some kind of camp in Western Germany, and living through all of the what is very, I think, evident to everyone, the long road ahead, not only just in terms of rebuilding the country physically, but in terms of addressing the ideology and the disaster of the Second World War and of Nazism. So I kind of see it as like, it makes sense to want to get out of there. If you're going to start anew, might as well start in a land of opportunity that's not all rubble and a long road ahead of making sense of it all.
Thanks for those responses. We'll turn over to some of the questions that we have in the Q&A. And there's a few here that deal with just questions about identifying eligibility or people that may have been complicit and were ineligible. So one is for Erica, just a question regarding Soviet Mennonites attaining German citizenship. Is this specifically when they entered Wortgau after the Great Trek, or how do the EWZ documents recovered by the Allies play into this? Were the EWZ records used as evidence of German citizenship? And I had a question I was hoping to ask the panelists as well, as what is the archival record available at the time to MCC that they're potentially using and that other officials are using, as opposed to what is the archival record we have at present? But there's another related question I'm going to go to for Ben, and that is related to your intersections piece. You write, in January 49, Peter Dick told M.R. Thomas that 95% of Russian Mennonites would not meet UN criteria for aid. Yet in July 49, when UN suspended Mennonite eligibility, Based on officer cross-checking for Nazi activity, Peter Dick expressed doubt over the representatives of the list. He then privately searched and found 147 Mennonite names with Nazi activity. Can you clarify the total number of names Dick investigated in proportion to the 147, or was it all of the 147? So Erica, you can take it away, and then Ben, and if anyone else wants to comment about the archival record at this point in time.
Thank you so much for the question. So there are a couple different steps that ethnic German Mennonites living in the Soviet Union would have taken to show their loyalty, their Germanness. So the very first I would suggest would be while they were still living in Ukraine during the Nazi occupation. Many did their best to get on what was known as the Volksliste, so to be recognized as a Volksdeutsche, as ethnic German. And then as the person asking the question mentioned, after the Great Trek, once they were resettled in the Warthegau and parts of Poland, they did interact with these Nazi officers who filled out the EWC papers for them. So on these papers, they would have indicated their ethnic background, which most of the time people put was 100% German. They would have indicated what languages they were familiar speaking. Once again, most of the time would have been German. And so, yes, these were largely a lot of the documents found later in the Berlin Document Center that were used to show that, in fact, they were considered Volksdeutsche, or that they had taken on German citizenship. And then just to briefly mention about what records were available, I'm not so sure about records that MCC had available, but I know, for instance, with the IGCR and some of those very early UN groups that were trying to investigate, some of the records they looked at was in the London Library. They also looked at some different research that historians had done, but from my understanding, it was relatively limited. And that's one of the reasons why IGCR felt that they had done such a thorough study and thought that they had this eligibility question decided, when in fact, of course, it wasn't decided.
So thanks, Linda, for the question about clarifying the archival research that Peter Dick did in 1949 in order to understand what some of the refugees under MCC's care had done or experienced, or what basically what had happened to them during World War II. So one thing to say about this is that it happened in 1949, not in 1946, which is when MCC started being really quite active in post-war Europe, working with these Mennonite refugees. It took them a long time to really want to dig into the available archival materials to find out what was actually available. And in fact, this particular archival dive that Peter Dick did in 1949 was prompted by an archival dive that had been done by a international refugee organization staff member who was checking the eligibility of Mennonite refugees from Soviet Ukraine against newly available wartime records from the SS, which were accessible now, by the later 1940s in a thing called the Berlin Document Center, which Erica mentioned. And that eligibility officer determined that far more of the Mennonites that were passing through the International Refugee Organization, this sort of UN-affiliated refugee body, had connections to German military units and had accepted German citizenship during the war than they were telling the refugee officers that were checking them, so that they were essentially not being truthful. And so the archival record was a way to assess that. And so Peter Dick wanted to know how representative is this charge that the Mennonites under MCC's care are not being truthful? How representative was that? And so he did not check the stories of every single person under MCC's care. That would have been thousands of individuals, but he chose at random, he chose a randomized sample of 147 names, and he submitted all of those names to the Berlin Document Center for assessment. And the report that he got back assessed that using the records that were available at that time in Berlin, there were records of over half of those individuals affirming that they had either accepted German citizenship during the war, or that they had been police officers or members of the military or members of the SS or something like that.
I'd just like to add to that description, because it's good to keep in mind that, in fact, a lot of those people, it was about accepting German citizenship. So for instance, of the 147 names, some of them went through without any problem. And then of the ones that came back, 35 belonged to men and about 39 belonged to women. And so for the majority of part, for the women, it was German citizenship. There was maybe a translator or two in there. And for the men, it was also largely German citizenship in 44, but there were a couple of cases of being a Nazi member of the party. There was a police officer, and there were one Waffen SS in 44. And so there was a mixed bag there, but definitely German citizenship was the big one in that particular list.
Great, thanks for jumping on that too, Aileen, because I was looking at another question that was sort of related to the issue of gender that you brought up. So Kate Molden asks, Dr. Friesen, you mentioned that the issue of patriarchy is involved in the willingness to maintain lies or to avoid acknowledgement of one's role in the war. Can you elaborate on the issue of patriarchy and how it might relate to playing the game and not addressing issues? And Kate has gone on with a question for Ben as well about whether you see in reading letters and diaries of people who have made anti-Semitic comments in their writings, the ones you cite are mostly men. Have you found these comments in women's diaries as well, or differences in anti-Semitism based on location or gender?
So in terms of the way in which patriarchy is running, I would also recommend reading Marlene Epps' book, Women Without Men, about the refugees of the Second World War and how this is. And I'm glad that Ben brought it up in his comments on the outset. Sometimes we forget that this is an issue about a lot of children. If you look at the MCC records, there are lots of children that are going through the system. If you look at photographs from the refugee camps, there are lots of children. And in addition, there are a lot of women-run households that are coming through here, as Erica also has made reference to. And so this is an important element of the story, and how they were treated is particularly interesting. MCC has definitely some moral chastising that is going on with who these women are, what they're allowed to do, and what their role should be. And so we can definitely see that in the records of MCC. In addition to, we can see the ways in which some of these men, and particularly, I think a lot of us are interested in the ways in which perpetrators use MCC's kind of or Mennonites, the system of patriarchy, and the ways in which you can relate yourself to someone else, or to kind of use that connection to have some sort of authority, runs through this, and is the way in which people can kind of be dismissive of some of their past actions and navigate this system to their benefit. And I think that that issue has not been fully explored, about how Mennonite men versus Mennonite women experience this system.
I'll just briefly respond to the question about gender, which is an important one, and definitely deserves further research. But as Aileen mentioned, Marlene Epps' book, Women Without Men, is a fabulous resource on this particular question that goes into great depth that I would highly recommend. I would also mention the sort of longer term consequences of the way in which gender was deployed, not at an individual level, but at the kind of macro level of how MCC talked about the refugees as a whole and their relationship to the Mennonite Church as a whole. There was a high degree of emphasis, as Marlene shows in her book, on the really truly terrible experiences of women, and the fact that these refugees disproportionately were women, and that has been one of the dominant ways in which this story has been remembered. It's a true and it's a harrowing one, but it has also been deployed, unfortunately, in some instances, to downplay the extent to which Mennonite men, many of whom weren't refugees under MCC's care because they were either killed during the war or were still in prisoner of war camps in the Soviet Union in the post-war period, the extent to which Mennonite men had served in German military units or participated in the security apparatus of the Nazi state in other ways.
Thanks, Aileen and Ben. We have another question here from Lisa Church, who writes, there were bans on Jews immigrating to the US and many other countries, contributing to many Jews moving to Palestine. Did MCC's advocacy to prioritize Mennonite refugees to the Americas impact Jewish attempts to immigrate to the Americas? Or maybe participants want to reflect more broadly about the ability to immigrate versus restrictions in this post-war period. And then I have another question I want to make sure we get in. There's a few different variations of this in the chat, but I'll go with Rebecca Sears, who asked it first. What are some concrete actions that you would recommend MCC can and should take to make amends or respond for these actions and this part of its history? So if you want to respond to either of those, I will note I will post into the chat as well the specific section from Intersections, which responds in part to that, but feel free to respond.
I'll take a stab at the first question. I think it's really hard to say what impact Mennonite immigration might have had on Jewish immigration or potential Jewish immigration. Certainly using funds from different UN organizations, I guess in one sense may have taken away funds from others, although I've never seen any research specifically indicating that. In general, right after World War II, both in the United States and in Canada, there just wasn't a lot of openness towards immigration generally, and specifically to Jews even. It took a few years before different legislation was passed. It was 1950, in fact, before the DP Act of 1948 was amended that allowed really open immigration for Jews and for others to the United States. So that's a great question, but I think it really is hard to know how Mennonite immigration may have or may not have had impacted Jewish immigration.
I can comment maybe on the second question. There was a couple of related questions there, I think, to that question. Mm-hmm. And questions of terms of atonement and making things right, that kind of these kind of terms. And I think it's, in my view, it's what we do, right? We can talk about the past and analyze it, and that's very important to have the historical record and the foundation in place and accurate. And because that really sets the foundation of truth. Someone asked about what's the significance of truth telling. And proceeding on a false foundation is highly problematic in a lot of ways, especially with these issues. And so in terms of self-understanding for MCC and for all of us, what is this organization about? And if someone's working for MCC, what are we about? What's our past? What is our present? Where are we going? And in order to have that in place, the historical record has to be acknowledged, and that's what we're doing here. And I think MCC is on a good path in terms of this Intersections volume, and which sparked this discussion. We have well over 100 people here, and these people will be talking to other people and so on. I think this is extremely important, not just for talking and learning, but for the implications and the ramifications of what's learned here. And the outside world is looking. And MCC is very well known in the world. We all know that, and very influential and highly respected. And so questions have arise, right? And so to lead the way, as I mentioned earlier about it, leading the way in terms of acknowledging these issues within the Mennonite community, I think MCC is on a right path, and also others will be watching and seeing, well, we know this about MCC now, so what are you doing about it? How are you talking about it? How are you reflecting, and how are you moving forward? And I think that's in these types of events, and in a commitment to anti-racism and decolonization and these types of issues, I think these are all very important issues in doing and moving forward, and also the public presentation of what MCC is about and what they're doing, where they're headed.
Stephen, I'm going to allow those to be the final words of our session as we've arrived here at 3:45. I was pretty sure when we set out we wouldn't have necessarily an opportunity to answer all the questions that these thought-provoking research projects have brought up. You can definitely feel free, as I've indicated in the chat, to write directly into Intersections with your further questions or suggestions about addressing this history, or contact us directly if you wanted to follow up with any one of the panelists at CTMS through University of Winnipeg. I want to thank all of you, Aileen, Stephen, Erica, Ben, and Anna especially, for joining us as well, for taking part in this event. And we hope you'll join us at future CTMS events as well. For now, we'll say goodbye.